I started learning about all these scientific experiments that have been done that take into account all the subtle realms, that take into account that there is an ether, that there is one substance. I had difficulty understanding the ether until I read some of Nikola Tesla's work that is not so well known.
I think people are probably familiar with ECGs and EEGs, the fact that the heart is a gigantic electrical and magnetic device, but also it produces a gigantic toroidal field because it vortexes the blood, and it's our main source of our biofield.
And what we've seen through the work of scientists that have broken out of this mainstream hold is that both affect the physical. It's not just the electromagnetic, but it's especially the subtle layers that affect the physical manifestations. And just like you, I'm also trained in hypnosis.
Our ancestors were better connected with these fields, so they didn't have any machines to find these places of power. They just knew. Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah, and today I'm joined by Nico from the Wellness Enterprise. So this is a slightly different podcast to usual because we're going to talk about some of the science behind things like the ether, subtle energy, which is then going to delve into the realms of spirituality. And Nico's background is in electrical engineering. So like me, he's an ex-scientist who then ended up in the giant rabbit hole of spirituality. So this is a conversation as opposed to a presentation, but Nico very kindly gave me his slide deck, which I've put in the description so that you can access it if you want to read about some of the references that we talk about in this podcast, or just digest the information in your own time. At the end of the podcast, Nico talks about the cosmic tower, but in order to understand how sacred geometry and such like works, the stuff we talk about in the bulk of the podcast will help to educate you on this matter, especially if it's an area that you're not familiar with. Welcome to the channel, Nico. Do you want to introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah, my name's Nico Martens. I'm originally from Belgium, and I'm in Belgium today on a rainy day. And I actually moved to the United States when I started working in the corporate world. So I'm a electromechanical engineer, and the things we're going to talk about today about more of the subtle realms and spirituality. I didn't believe in any of this for 36 years. And then my mother passed away in 2012. And I hit rock bottom when I went back to the US. And then things started to happen. I'm starting to have these dreams that had my mother in it. And I started to get all these thoughts. I'm like, these are like strange thoughts. And then one day I thought, like, what if these are not my own thoughts? What if this is my mother communicating to me? And then the cat was out of the bag, because I learned how to meditate, and I learned how to connect with the other realms, to where, once you start waking up, the universe in a sense conspires for you to keep following that path. So I met my first mentor, who was a Reiki master, and she had never met my mother, because my mother was still living in Belgium, and I was in the United States. And we would have lunch every 2 weeks, and she could channel my mother as if she was sitting at the table. And she would tell all these things like, do you remember this happened in your childhood, which the lady could have never known. And then my mother was like, well, Nico's going to be really skeptical about all this, because he's trained as a scientist with no belief in a higher power or in a universal mind, whatever you like to call it. So what she did was she predicted all these things from the future. Your father's going to have a new girlfriend. She's going to be 7 years younger than him. Her name's going to be gotta leave, but she wants to be called Leave. And she predicted all these things, even to what we were going to eat on the first time I was going to meet my dad's new girlfriend. And then all those things just started to happen, and they started to come true. So I had to come, to the realization that being so science-minded and only believing that to be the truth, that I might have excluded a lot. So I was like, I really realized that I don't know anything. So I spent a lot of time unlearning everything that I was taught in school. And then I started learning about all these scientific experiments that have been done that take into account all the subtle realms, that take into account that there is an ether, that there is one substance that everything is made up of. And when I started to look how many researchers had went in that I never had heard of, and I started looking at their work, all of a sudden it was no longer spirituality and science. Taking that science that they came up with and that they did experiments on, to really look at it from that point of view, that for me married spirituality and science. And all of a sudden I started to get answers for things that as a 15-year-old that I did not understand in physics class, and that I would ask my teachers about. All of a sudden I had my answers, but not in the traditional science. Like I would ask my teacher, she would explain about how light is a wave traveling like from the sun. I was like, well, but if the vacuum's really empty, how can a vibration get here all the way? You need a medium to vibrate, right? And then, oh, but light can also be a particle. I mean, how can it be both, right? How can light hit a window, slow down, and then come out of the window and speed back up? That didn't make any sense to me. So luckily, by going into the science that has been suppressed, and we don't have to go into why that is, that really brought me in a different understanding. And what it did, it brought me back to like the ancient wisdom. If you look at Chinese medicine, like all the ancient traditions, all of a sudden I had a scientific explanation for what had happened, but not within the mainstream paradigm. And that's really what I love investigating now and learning more about that, because I believe for us as a society and the challenges we're faced with, it's clear that in the traditional particle paradigm, the traditional paradigm of medicine, where we only look at chemical interactions, it simply does not have an answer for all these phenomena in nature. They just can't be explained with mainstream science. So I really love to go approach the subtle realm from a scientific point of view, but we need a new science for that. And luckily it's all there, and it has been there. It's just a matter of opening our mind to it. And I would love for people to become a true skeptic again, because in our society, a skeptic basically means if something does not correspond to what we have been told, I'm not even going to look at it and I'm not going to believe it. For me, a true skeptic and a true scientist is somebody that looks at everything and all the data presented with an open mind, with as little as possible, like preconditioned notions of how it should be, and then only make up your mind once you see the data and once you've really investigated all the other points of view.
Absolutely. But I think also experiencing something firsthand goes a long way, because like you, I did biochemistry, I did biophysics, I worked in a lab for over 10 years, but there was just so many unexplainable phenomenon that we all knew happened. We just pretended that it didn't. And also amongst scientists, it's kind of embarrassing to talk about things like quantum entanglement or synchronicity. And we did talk about religion, but I think a lot of people were already skeptical of Christianity, but lots of people were seeking something else, because I think when it comes to suppressed science, there's also a lot of suppressed ancient texts, and our ancestors knew a lot about quantum physics. I mean, because I'm very interested in the Kabbalah, that's probably what I know the best, but there are also numerous other ancient texts that people can look into, and practices, because I think what's very important is these things that we're talking about, you can put into practice and you can feel and experience for yourself. So maybe for the listeners, just so if we start off at the basics of kind of the fabric of sort of the universe and reality, that most people are familiar with water being a medium and how it can transfer energy and information. And there's a lot more to water than we realize. And it's, I think, when I talk about, say, the baby and the bath water is actually the most important thing, which is the what's dissolved in our water and how it can convey information. So maybe if you explain, because you're an expert in water as well, start with the water and then move into the ether, so that people have got something tangible to compare. And if they've never heard of the ether before, it's sort of a nice transition.
Yeah, the ether is a tricky one. It's like trying to explain to a fish what water is, right? I mean, we're in it, we're made up of it. So it's right under our nose, which oftentimes is the most difficult thing to see. And you bring up a good point. Water is so much more than H2O, than the chemical substance. And really that has been proven in a lot of work. I mean, if you look at Masaru Emoto's work, which probably most people are familiar with, who flash froze water and then would take pictures of the crystals of the water, he would see that water that was in a really pristine, energetic environment shows the beautiful hexagonal structure, almost like a mandala, and beautiful symmetry. And then water from Fukushima, for example, or from a polluted river was all distorted, right? So that shows us that water is not only a physical substance, but it's also a carrier of information. And that this information that is carried in the water, we can change with our intention, right? He shows water that was polluted and then showed the same water that was sprayed over, and then all of a sudden the beautiful structures are back. So that shows us another thing, which is that water is conscious, right? And that we, with our intention, with our consciousness, we can change the shape, the structure of the water, which I really see as information. We change the information that the water carries. And then there's also the fact that our human body is mainly water. Why? Right? Why not make it from stainless steel or something? And again, that comes back to water, being able to carry the information. All of life originated from the oceans, and water is instrumental, not only for our health, but to thrive and for our entire environment. So Gerald Pollack's work from the University of Washington showed that water has more than the phases that we know of, like ice, liquid, and vapor, but that there's also a fourth phase of water. And the fourth phase, you can look at the living water. So the water in our bodies is in the fourth phase. The water in plants is in the fourth phase. And when we get that hexagonal structure, he noticed that water is like a bio battery, its ability to carry a charge. And for me, on the physical level, it's in the water that our life force is. So what happens is, as Masaru Emoto then shows, and there's other scientists like Wolfgang Ludwig also showed, like, you can filter water and treat it chemically as much as you can. But if you do not address the vibrations that are in the water, aka the information, it's still very detrimental to our health. So for me, everything is consciousness, right? Science, mainstream science tells us that we are separate from our environment, that we have consciousness, but nothing else does. But it's very clear, and like the spiritual traditions say, well, everything is consciousness. Everything is consciousness. Most people that have pets, that they're conscious beings. And when I say consciousness, that doesn't mean that they're like humans thinking. There's many levels of consciousness, and there's many levels of intelligence. And once you see us as an integral part of the environment, then our whole view needs to change, because if our environment doesn't thrive, we don't thrive. What I breathe out, the tree over there breathes in. What it breathes out, I breathe back in. So we have to look at the trees, at the plants, as external organs to us, but there is really no external. We are all one big organism. We live in the body of the earth, right? And I think that's really important, definitely to address the challenges that we have now. We have to look more holistically. We cannot just look at trying to achieve health for ourselves and leave the environment out of it, right? Because as I just mentioned, Masaru Emoto showed very clearly that the energetic environment that the water is in affects the quality and the informational quality of the water. So we have to look at things at health more holistically, and our environment needs to be a part of that.
Oh, absolutely. Because one of the ways I moved out of my left brain into my right brain was I got very interested in hypnosis, and I did stage hypnosis and all sorts. And there's still things which I don't understand about it. And I don't, I've never done what Dolores Cannon does, but if people are interested in, she's worth a read. Every day I kind of have a new theory of how hypnosis works. And I'm not even sure if I'm actually talking to somebody's water, because just being in an environment where people don't like you, even if they don't say so, you feel it and it's horrible. And if you say nice things to people, and I think a lot goes from just say, nice words versus nasty words to other people, or even, and again, as we're going to talk about the ether, our thoughts or our intention. Again, Rupert Sheldrake talks a lot about how intention and telepathy are very strongly linked. People can look into that. So this, what your intention is, can be perceived by us on some kind of level, be it the water interaction or the etheric interaction. So absolutely, I completely agree about, we're at one with the universe. I know it sounds a bit cheesy, but I think a lot of people just feel disconnected and they're not part of something, and it can be sort of really depressing. And the other thing which we were talking about off camera is this idea of feeling powerless and fear, again, about certain things that happen in our environment that we feel we don't have control over, but maybe do. For example, geoengineering, non-native EMFs, things like that tend to be something that bother people a lot. So that was a great sort of talk about water. How would you explain the ether to people who've never heard of it before?
Yeah, the ether is like the one substance that everything is made up of. And for the longest time, I had difficulty understanding the ether until I read some of Nikola Tesla's work that is not so well known, and I found it. And what he said, it's not a question whether there's an ether or not. The question is, what are the attributes of this ether? So traditionally, people understand the ether as this really fine, almost like gaseous matter. He's like, that's a big mistake. The ether is actually really, really dense. It has a lot of energy in it. And once you understand that the ether is really, really dense, you can almost look as matter being a gaseous state of the ether. So you can imagine it when two waves collide and then water comes up from it, you can look at the water that splashes up as being matter. So the ether really is really, really dense, which we get into later, explains scalar waves and quantum entanglement, because the denser the medium is, the faster a wave travels through the ether. The other misconception is that the ether is just this still mass in a way, and that there is nothing going on with it, but the ether is really dynamic. It's made up of toroidal fields, of vortexes, everywhere. And once you understand that there is an ether, and the ether has really special properties that we might not be used to, like it's like superconductive while it's really dense, and it's like a fluid-like substance. So you can look at water also being made up of the ether, and then the ether being fluid-like, and that also then immediately explains how like a pyramid works. You can look at it as a funnel being in the ether. And once we take into account, which scientists actually have no quarrel about now, that everything is made up of one substance, they just really have a hard time wrapping their head around it, because I'm not that well versed like in the quantum physics field, but they're talking about like a quantum superfluid too, right? They had to admit that there was something, that space is not simply empty or void of anything, right?
But absolutely, but also it's mathematically inconvenient to try and compute for the ether. And with science, of course, it has lots of uses, but we have lots of constants and fudge factors and equations, and we fit things to a model, which again, the model is purely based on hypothesis. And sometimes things need to be trimmed down to make it more understandable. And I think people might have heard of something like 0 point energy and things like that, and heard of the ether called different things, because it's not something new, like you said. So what other names for the ether might people who have come across this but didn't realize it was the same thing, and it was actually a bona fide aspect of physics?
Yeah, prana, mana, and then chi as being a form of ether. These are all made up of the ether, but just with different pressures, different speeds. So this one substance really is what makes up everything, right? And it's like I said earlier, it's like trying to explain to a fish what water is. It becomes difficult to wrap your head around, but you brought up a good point. Like, I was also trained in mainstream science, and they teach us as if it's fact, but it's really hypothesis. And when I meet with like another scientist and they talk about the field, I'm like, you explain to me what the field really is. Well, it does this and it does that. No, no, no. Those are attributes.
Mhm.
Explain to me what the field really is. Explain to me what energy really is. And as scientists, they cannot explain it. They can only describe attributes of it and effects that it creates, but that does not tell you what something is. And for me, like the scientists, they're so far away. You talked earlier about the importance of having an experience. For me, knowledge is just potential, but it's only when you've experienced it firsthand that it can become wisdom. And that's where my issue lies with traditional science, that they have equations that are so complicated that I don't understand them, to be honest with you. But I also know, having worked with spiritual masters, people that really master something, they can explain it to a 5-year-old. If they have to hide behind all these complicated mathematics and equations, that just tells me they don't really understand it yet. And I believe Mother Nature it's simple. I think everything, when you get to the truth of it, it's simple, even though the effects that you observe can be very complicated and very complex. At at the core of it, it's very simple. Mother Nature's not running around with a calculator doing equations, and there's just universal laws, and there's ways that things behave that are according to those laws, right?
Oh, absolutely. In this, you talked about scalar waves, toroidal fields, and then I think people are probably familiar with ECGs and EEGs, the fact that the heart is a gigantic electrical and magnetic device, but also it produces a gigantic toroidal field because it vortexes the blood, and it's our main source of our biofield. But also there are other torus fields in the body, like DNA. Also, each nostril creates a vortex, doesn't it? And that's why breathing, or one of the many reasons why breathing is such an integral part of spiritual practices. So do you want to maybe explain to people what a torus field or a toroidal wave is, and other words that people might have come across? Because again, I've heard it called different things, like an aura and all sorts of words, and I know people are referring to the same thing, or a life force. I've heard people say it's how the planets move. So maybe it's for people who are new to it.
Yes. So let's go back to everything is made up from one substance, right? And you have a wave in it. The waves figured out that the only ways that the waves could sustain themselves is by always coming back to the same center.
Mm-hmm.
So this shape starts to form. That's really the elemental shape, that everything, the elemental flow that everything is made up of, which is a toroidal field. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen somebody blow a smoke ring that just travels. That is a toroidal field. And everything from the smallest, from the micro, all the way from atoms to electrons to the universe itself, is made up of one or more of these shapes, of these toroidal fields. And you can look at it like two vortexes and two cones that kiss in the middle in one point. And it's like the donut shape. But you have to see it in a three-dimensional shape, to where actually everything is made up of these toroidal fields. And then because we know that there really is no matter at, if you go to the core of everything, there is no matter. There's energy, there's vibration, there's frequency. As Nikola Tesla said, if you want to understand the universe, you got to think in terms of energy, vibration, and frequency. Now, if we say energy is the ether, then then we can create a vibration, because you cannot create a vibration if you don't have a medium to vibrate, right? So everything is made up of vibration, and then vibration, if we turn it back on itself, when it starts turning back on itself, it creates a toroidal field which has the ability to sustain. Like, people can look up the work of physician Hans Jenny, who took sand and put it on a speaker, and then he would vibrate that speaker or that drum with certain vibration, and all of a sudden, all these beautiful shapes start to form. Now replace the sand with the ether, and all of a sudden we start understanding how matter is actually shaped. At its core, it's all vibration. And it's all these toroidal fields that are nested into each other. So really everything is energy. And as we change the vibration of something, then we change its expression as it becomes matter, right? So you can take the whole table of elements, the table of Mendeleev, we can take it, and rather than using the orbitals and everything you learned about in chemistry, you can real easily look at it from a toroidal point of view. And then what these waves, what these toroidal fields realized, in order, when they're compressed, in order to sustain, they have to do it at certain angles. That's where the platonic solids then come from, that people might be familiar with, the tetrahedron, the cube, icosahedron, etc. And you can actually break up the entire table of Mendeleev and organize it according to the platonic solids.
That's a brilliant explanation, because what I always bring back to or think about is reality and actuality, because obviously there's the reality of how the universe is, but I can actually feel my face, or I think I can, and this table would collapse if it was just made of vibration. So I think that's a fundamental sort of way of explaining to people about the reality and actuality, because people can go absolutely crazy if they kind of analyze things like this. So how would you sort of distinguish between matter and our daily life and what actually goes on? Because you must have your own way of explaining reality and actuality.
Yeah, it's all vibration. It's all expressions of the same ether, but just under different conditions, right? When something has a higher vibration, it has a different expression of when it's like at a lower vibration. And just like people can understand that sound is a pressure wave traveling through the air, which then gets picked up by our ears, and that then translated in a certain experience of sound, we should also look as light being a vibration traveling to the ether. So what we're seeing, I don't subscribe to this whole particle wave duality. Everything is waves. And what we consider a particle, it's really waves that come together and form certain patterns. And you don't have to look far to see the toroidal field everywhere. You talked about the heart. Heart math shows the toroidal field. You can see it around the human is the toroidal field. You look in the center of a tomato or an apple, you see the toroidal field. You look at a tree and you take into account the root system, what do you see again? It's the toroidal field. You look at a galaxy, you see the toroidal field, but we only look at the disk in the middle, which is then the manifestation of the matter. But if you go look energetically, you see a toroidal field. Look at the magnetic field of the earth. It's the toroidal field. It's all that same shape. And when we start thinking that way and start seeing the toroidal shape in everything, it really gives us a different understanding. And just connecting even with our own toroidal field and visualizing that, it's a very powerful practice to raise our energy and to really get connected, because we are one with our environment and with the universe. So science kind of strays us away from that because we're only looking at the effects, and everybody knows what we can perceive as visible light. What we see is a really small spectrum of what's really there. So we have to include everything that's subtle and that's unseen and realize how much an effect that it has on like the physical manifestations. A lot of people now are very aware of electromagnetism, EMF, non-native EMF, and it's very clear that this affects our physical body, but it's also, and that's all what I call the slower than the speed of light, which is where all the scientists are focused. But then we have the faster than the speed of light, which are the subtle realms. And this is where we have vitality, energy. This is where our emotions are, where the mental planes are, and the spiritual plane. And what we've seen through the work of scientists that have broken out of this mainstream hold is that both affect the physical. It's not just the electromagnetic, but it's especially the subtle layers that affect the physical manifestations. And just like you, I'm also trained in hypnosis, and I worked with people doing regression with people with physical ailments. And how often do you see it when you really resolve something on the mental plane? And then even in this what we call the subconscious mind, the physical symptoms go away. And that's a clear indication because, you know, we have diseases or dis-ease that comes from our environment, but a lot of them come from our internal environment, from our thoughts, from our emotions, right? We can have a mental blockage and we don't do anything about it, and then it starts making itself known through feelings in the body that show us like, hey, you are not in alignment here with the universe, with the universal flow, with universal order. And then if we don't do anything about it and we stuff away the emotions, well, then it starts manifesting on the physical plane, because it starts traveling from these faster than light realms all the way into like the speed of light and below in the physical plane. So for me, it's really important that we acknowledge the subtle realms and that they no longer are part of woo-woo, but actually that these are science now, just not the mainstream science as is being taught in school.
Okay, that's great, because you've talked about the subtle realm, which some people understand, but then there's also another great big topic in spirituality, which consciousness is greater than our own, and this might be spirit guides, a relative, an angel, another elementals, all kinds of things, which are, maybe I'll just pick angels because they're kind of fairly neutral, because they're in lots of different religions and people who are not religious. How would you go about explaining it? You can either say actuality or reality, this idea of beings, or people might have heard of fifth dimensional being. Think this topic.
Yeah, just think of them living in a realm that is outside of what we can perceive with the physical senses. And we are part of those realms too. We are multidimensional beings. So you can imagine everything coming from one source and then traveling down through the spiritual, through the mental, through the emotional, through the vitality plane, and then ultimately creating a physical body. To me, it's not the physical body that has an aura, it's the aura that shapes the physical body. And it's recognizing that what underlies the physical manifestation are realms that we cannot perceive with our senses. That doesn't mean we cannot perceive them, because we are connected to them. So I look at it as life existing at many different vibrational realms, and we are connected to those. It's just a matter, are we aware of them or not? And just as we interact through waves here, right? Through sound waves, but also through other ways, through feelings. Just like we connect here, we also connect through all the different layers, through all the different vibrations. And a good example of that is, most people know about resonance. If you strike a tuning fork, and then you have another tuning fork with like the same quality, the same wavelength, it starts vibrating also. But then we also have what is called harmonics. And harmonics is that if I take a string, for example, and I vibrate it, a string of the same length is going to start vibrating. But also a string that is double the length or half of the length will also start vibrating. So you see that the vibration is not only transmitted at the level, at the same level, but there's also a communication that happens through all the vibrational realms, through resonance. So that'd be the simple way for me to explain it, because the string length you can basically equate to frequency. Right?
Absolutely, that makes perfect sense. So that basically ties me back into what we were talking about before, that if our senses and our perception are based on vibrations and frequencies, and then we've brought up the higher dimensional idea, how does this now link back into non-native EMFs? Because people can think about them in different ways, because it can be invisible light that we can't see. The book The Invisible Rainbow is a great place to start learning about them. And there are different frequencies and wavelengths of these non-native EMFs. So how would you explain to people why non-native EMFs are a problem for our existence? I mean, sure, we know the biochemical side about calcium disruption, creating white noise for the mitochondria, but from a sort of higher level, maybe if you want to explain because again, there are people who are very spiritual who can swear blind to me that they can't do whatever they do properly unless they're outside up a mountain, because the EMF stop them being able to channel or do whatever they do. And I completely believe them. I want to thank my sponsor, Lightwater Scientific, who helped me deliver free, valuable information to you and also allow me to have great guests on this channel. Lightwater Scientific produce the purest and most deuterium-depleted water in the world. Depleting or lowering your deuterium has numerous health benefits, from better metabolic health, more energy, greater resilience, less brain fog, increased physical performance, enhanced healing, and healthier mitochondria. Deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen, also known as heavy water, because it's bigger and heavier than regular hydrogen. Even though deuterium makes up only 0.02% of hydrogen, it's found everywhere. Deuterium is a burden to your body because it interferes with the intricate chemical reactions that occur by slowing them down. Deuterium is kryptonite to your mitochondria, and we need healthy mitochondria to produce energy. There's over 60 years of scientific research on the negative effects of too much deuterium on health, and also the positive benefits of lowering deuterium in the body. Lightwater deuterium-depleted water is 100% safe and non-toxic. In fact, it's the closest in structure to the metabolic water that your mitochondria produce. Lightwater deuterium-depleted water comes in 5 or 10 parts per million glass or plastic bottles. So level up your health by leveling down your deuterium today. The purchase link is in the show notes, and use code Dr. Sara for a discount off your order.
Yes, absolutely. And when we talk about non-native EMFs, because of the way mainstream science approaches everything, we're only thinking about electromagnetic waves. And absolutely, electromagnetic waves, they are an issue, because if you go look in the body and in nature, the communication happens through magnetism and waves, electromagnetic waves. I mean, the Russian scientist, I think this was Kaznachev, he actually took a petri dish with embryos from chickens that were dying, and then he put some other ones in another room with just like a crystal window in between them. And what they saw is that the healthy ones also starting to die, basically meaning that there was a communication happening that was not purely chemically based. Now, we'll start with the part that that most of us understand, which is the electromagnetic interference. The problem with that is we have to really look at it from an information level point of view, that everything in the body is regulated through these subtle processes and through wave communication. And the problem with non-native EMF is that the EMF that we're putting out there is 1,000 times more powerful than the very subtle, weak yet very important communication wave that nature uses both within the body and also within the environment. But there is something that is even more important, which is the phenomena of electrosmog. So we've had a lot of people that would shield as much as they can and try to block out the electromagnetic radiation, and I'm not against that, but it's only a partial solution, because there is also a component that is not electromagnetic in nature, which we call electrosmog. And the best analogy I could give you is, if you see a boat traveling through a river or water, you have this initial pressure wave that affects an object in it. You could look at that as the electromagnetic radiation. Now, what do you see minutes or sometimes even longer after the boat has passed through? You see all these small little waves. And these small little waves, they linger for much longer and they spread over much further distances, right? And then what happens is, if there's many boats going through, they kind of go in resonance and they start forming these standing waves, which last for a very long time. So while we can measure the initial pressure wave with an EMF meter, these subtle waves, these ripples that are being caused, they're actually longitudinal compression waves, and they are not electromagnetic in nature. So what that means is that these waves, they distort all the subtle levels that we talked about earlier, the emotional plane, the energy plane, the mental plane, and all the higher planes. They are constantly being disrupted by all these smaller waves. Another way to look at this, you could look at the electromagnetic radiation as the rain coming down, but then the fog that forms and lingers is like the electrosmog. So the same happens as with a boat. The same happens with an EMF source, a man-made EMF source. So you have the electromagnetic, and then you have all these longitudinal compression waves, these subtle distortions that spread far and wide through our environment. And these you cannot measure with an electromagnetic meter, but they distort all of our mental planes. That's why mental, emotional, you name it. That's why a lot of people, their symptoms of EMF might not be so physical, but it could be difficulty sleeping, depression, just not having like any zest for life, nervousness, anxiety. Why is that? Because of those waves spreading. So I like to look at it as an information model. Like you have the electromagnetic carrier wave, but then you have the information that is carried far and wide through our environment, and you cannot shield from it. These are what we call scalar waves, and they will travel through matter. They will travel through a Faraday cage. So that's why the only way out of the whole non-native EMF challenge is that we need to harmonize those. The beauty of it is there are solutions to where you can harmonize that information. So to where you can say, yeah, we have these carrier waves and they spread the information of the source, which is detrimental with man-made EMF. But what we can actually do is we can harmonize the information to be beneficial to life.
Oh yeah, because I think when you say harmonizers, people think of stickers that you stick on your phone and your computer, but also you touched on sacred geometry earlier and glossed over, and then people like Dr. Ibrahim have set up things which can harmonize, but it's extremely difficult and technical to do.
Yes.
I wouldn't be able to do it. I mean, I could build a pyramid and I can build a few other things, but when it comes to dealing with these, what kind of approach from what you've been talking about earlier, what do people use, and what can we use to help? And what
Yeah.
doesn't help? Because yeah, sure, this is EMF blocking clothing, and I know it's got its massive limitations, and it may even make it worse. I don't know. I just happen to be cold, so I put it on. But let's maybe talk about what doesn't help with the non-native EMFs. And again, getting terrified and in a panic, that's the worst thing people can do.
And that's a good point you bring up, because remember, all our thoughts, our emotions, like they create these secondary waves also in the subtle realm. So we're not only dealing with electrosmog from man-made sources, technical sources, but we also have emotional smog and mental smog that lingers in our environment. And I'm sure people have experienced this. If you walk into a room where people are being really negative, you just feel like, oh, I don't like the energy here and I don't feel good. While if you step in a room where people are all happy and they're laughing and they're having a good time, you feel uplifted. So we have a responsibility for every thought, because our awareness, when we connect with any other living organism, you change it, you affect it for better or worse. Right. So one of the things, like we were talking about chemtrails earlier, what really adds to it is people get really angry and feel disempowered, because what are we doing now? We're creating even more mental and emotional smog. So spiritual practices, prayer, whatever your practice is, all these things that gives us in a high state of vibration and harmony and in unity with all of creation, they have a harmonizing effect in all these realms, right? And there are also like solutions. We'll be talking about the cosmic tower today. It's like one solution that creates harmony on these planes. And you brought up Dr. Ibrahim Karim, which I love his work. And he actually filled in so many of the gaps for me. And people can look this up if they go, I think, to biogeometry.com. There is a project from 2003, and they call it the Miracle of Hamburg. And in a nutshell, what happened is Swiss Telecom installed antennas in a church, and people started to have severe electrosensitivity symptoms, like I talked earlier, the depression and you name it. And all the animals that could flee, they fled the area. The birds were leaving, the bats were leaving. The animals that couldn't flee, like cows, etc., what they noticed is when they processed them for meat, they started to develop tumors in their organs. So then the Swiss Telecom and then the Swiss government actually called in Dr. Ibrahim Karim, because people were doing what you're doing. They were, using the shielding and all that, but they were getting no relief. And then what Dr. Ibrahim Karim did, he created this harmony on the subtle realms by placing certain shapes in strategic positions. And what happened was all the symptoms, they went away, and the birds came back into the area, and the bats came back into the area. And for me, this is really like a landmark, project, because not only the Swiss Telecom and the Swiss government have to admit on TV that there was a problem, right? But it also showed that there were solutions, that it's not shielding, because what did Dr. Karim do? Through placing these shapes, he was harmonizing the energy on the subtle levels. And because of that, he was also changing the quality that was being carried out by these antennas to not be harmful to life, but to be beneficial to life. And people should really look at that study. I mean, he has done so much amazing work to where he has really turned this into a science of quality. One of my favorite examples is, I think it was one of his students, he took water from the Red Sea, and that's some of the saltiest water on the earth. And without desalinating it, without doing anything chemically or running it through a filter, only running it through certain shapes that would harmonize it and bring the life force back in, he was growing sweet potatoes from this water, which had not been chemically altered. Not only did the sweet potatoes grow, but they actually grew healthier and larger than the control sweet potatoes that were grown with fresh water.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting about the biogeometry and growing vegetables, because Matt from Cultivate Elevate has been on, and he grows giant vegetables using very simple shapes. But it's just to show to people that something doesn't have to be a machine, and that's probably even worse, because again, there are certain machines I've seen that are supposedly meant to do something with non-native EMFs, but to me that's just adding more problem onto the problem. So you're saying that using shapes, it's possible to harmonize. Also, I brought up water in the beginning because that's an integral part of the cosmic tower. And then the reason we talked a lot about souls or higher beings or different dimensional beings, that's a misunderstood component of the cosmic tower. So maybe for people who are not sure what we're talking about, if you want to explain a bit deeper.
Yeah, so we can go into the cosmic tower, and can give people a basic understanding, because one of the things we didn't talk about is that the toroidal field also creates these scalar waves, right? And you can have a toroidal field being created from a man-made technical solution, which then spreads a quality that is detrimental to life, not only through the physical environment, but as we talked, also to all the subtle layers. Now, the opposite is also true. If you go to a power spot in nature, or you go to Lourdes, or where you have the water coming out, it happens through toroidal field, because you have underwater ways that cross each other. But this water is living water that has a lot of beneficial natural information in it. So the toroidal field that is being created, this shape then creates waves that will go very far, that actually harmonize the environment. That's why if you go to such a place in nature, you feel rejuvenated, you feel energetic, and it's much easier when you gave the example about the psychics that have the issue, connecting in an environment, because basically it's like the channel that they need to connect through to the more subtle realms is all distorted. While if we go out in nature and we're in a relaxed state, we have much more access to those subtle realms, and it's much easier because there's less noise in the system.
Lots of churches in Europe and the UK were built on places of power, and then rectories, like my mum and dad's house, is a place of power, just by our ancestors were better connected with these fields, so they didn't have any machines to find these places of power. They just knew where to play. And I mean other buildings also, there'll be mosques and synagogues, I think they had to kind of hide them, but a lot of these other temples are built on a place of power. So it's something I think is really interesting. Again, looping back to our ancestors knew all of this already. So again, with the cosmic tower, is that then something that it can make your own personal place of power.
It is like a portable power spot, because if you look what is in the cosmic tower, you have two water vessels, one at the top, one at the bottom, and you have a crystal in the middle. Now, this water is not tap water. This is living water. And like we talked about the fourth phase of water with Gerald Pollack and that hexagonal structure. But what is important is that this water comes from different healing wells. And because of that, it has the full spectrum of light into it. We are light beings. We need the entire spectrum of light to thrive. So what then happens is the cosmic towers, they're activated to where the water in the bottom is going to go counterclockwise, and the water at the top is going to go clockwise. What does this create? It creates this toroidal field. What is in this toroidal field? The quality of what created it, which in this case is this healing water with the full spectrum of light that living organisms need to thrive. Now, then once that toroidal field is opened up, this actually then connects to all of the higher dimensions, just like happens in a power spot in nature. This is why it's not about the churches. It's not about the temples. It's about the power spot that they are built upon. That's why they were built on these places, because these places naturally created an access point for these higher dimensional energies to come in. And I was lucky enough to spend the last 2 winters in Egypt. So I got to experience it firsthand. And it was clear, if you've been at the pyramids,
Yeah, I
that
have.
this was not a primitive race, that just put these together, right? It's clear that they were very advanced. And you can actually look at these temples, you can measure them, and they all vibrate at a certain frequency. And then because of where they are built, they emanate this beneficial frequency through the entire environment. And that's why it's such a disaster that like certain temples, like the Temple of Isis in Aswan, that they actually moved it, because they moved it off of what made it work, right? Which is the power spot. And as you already said, our ancestors weren't running around with a meter to figure out where these were, right? They would notice if they had sheep or whatever, that in a certain environment, they would really thrive, right? They were like, ooh, this spot is special. So what do? They put a stone on it, or then they would build a menhir, and then they would build different shapes. But the shapes is not what gives it power. The shapes is what can amplify the quality, right? And spread it out more, but it's really of what's there already in that spot. And the
For
beauty that
example,
Mhm.
Stonehenge isn't the most pretty of things, but obviously that's a place of power and it's got its significance, but it isn't as geometrically intricate as the pyramids.
Absolutely. And we find them all over. I mean, even here in Belgium, the Druids,
Hmm.
right? I mean, all the cathedrals that are being built, they're built on these power spots, and they can have a really harmonizing effect when you go there and people sing and they're uplifted, right? All of that amplifies, because remember, we are conscious, but everything else in our environment is conscious too. And when we join with another consciousness, or we all join together with a beautiful intention and in harmony, then it's much more powerful than the sum of the parts, the effect that you get. So the cosmic tower works on this same principle, using water, but it basically creates a power spot that you can move. And because of that, we're helping nature. I mean, it's one of the things I strongly feel about. We have to become stewards of nature again, versus cannibalizing nature. And we can do this through harmonizing, and the cosmic towers are one way of doing that. Because I'll tell you, I absolutely love biogeometry. I think the work's amazing. It's given me so much insight. It works as a solution. Obviously, Dr. Ibrahim Karim has proven this over and over and over in all kinds of fields, from agriculture all the way to cars to airplanes. He's had the results, but it's not easy. There is a lot of
Yeah.
study that is involved, and I've been studying it, and it's really helped me because he has the tools to measure these subtle planes that we talked about. And then also he teaches how you can affect those and change those and harmonize them. And that's why I believe the cosmic tower is a simpler solution, because it's a power spot. And absolutely, if you connect with your consciousness with it, it becomes more powerful. But yeah, it's just much easier. You don't need all the knowledge from biogeometry to be able to implement the solution.
Yeah, and also when it comes to skeptics, my parents are like the prime examples in one way. Although my mum thinks everything on the internet and what she reads in the paper is real. However, you brought up something really important, because some people who've already heard of a tower think it opens a portal, whereas you're saying it's just opening us up as a connection to source.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think when we were talking before, we were talking about non-native EMFs as something that it interferes with our body. So if you harmonize it, it's almost like our body can't see it anymore. Would that be a kind of simple way, like very simple to somebody like my parents, who, but by the way, have other, I got them a tower, they don't want it because of, it's called a soul. And that's why I deliberately brought up this very important part of the
Yeah.
conscious side of the tower, because for people who, I've let you explain to people a huge amount about sort of science and spirituality. So this is more for if you're interested in what we're talking about, the tower, or you own one, or you've heard about it, or you want to look up the wellness enterprise afterwards. This, I'm just going back. So we accept it opens we will just say a connection to source, and then you would say it harmonizes the non-native EMFs, so they are still there, but they no longer disturb our biology. Is that simple enough, or do you want to sort of add a bit more?
No, that's simple. That's simple enough. And remember, I mean, a quote unquote portal like souls, I like to steer away from those terms because of the programming. People, you know, have all sorts of thoughts around it that might not be accurate. There's a portal within you. There's a tree within a tree. There is a portal, as in like within the center of this toroid, it is connected to all the higher realms, all the way back to the source. And this is where the issue lies with some of the man-made technologies. They don't have that connection all the way back to the source. So the life energy doesn't flow through. I mean, we look at the life force energy as only being an electrical charge, for example, but that's not true, right? There are qualities on all the subtle realms of existence. And yes, it opens up. Yes, it's connected through all the way back through source and into these higher realms, just as we are, right? And any living organism is, right?
Okay. Yeah, because that's the other thing which just reminded me. Would certain people view it as being blasphemous?
Well, those are very, very limited beliefs, in my opinion. And honestly, I will never step on anybody's free will.
Mm.
Everybody is free to make up their mind. I'm not like, oh, we want to sell as many towers. No. We want to present the tower, to share it with the world, to share what it can do. If it resonates with you, then it's for you. If you say, I don't believe this or whatever, that's totally fine. You can have your own beliefs. And I'm a prime example. I didn't believe in any of this stuff, but then something had to happen in my life because the universe is going to poke you because you're not in alignment with the universal truth. So it will constantly bring situations onto your path to nudge you, to help wake you up. But I don't ever try to wake people up or try to convince them. I just like to share. And if it helps you, great. I can only plant the seed, but it's not up to me to determine when that seed should start flowering. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Because that's what I try and do on this channel. I always say I'll let the experts speak, even if I don't know anything about it or I don't completely agree with it yet. You know, what do I know? And it's also something people have to think for themselves. And also, like you said, we all resonate at different frequencies anyway. And what works for one person, it might not work, you know, might not appeal to another. And also, sometimes it's not the right time for something, like you've just said. And it's also people should also, like you said, be a skeptic and think for themselves. But I always want to offer people information because, like you've said, and I know full well, I could do hours of recordings on hidden science. It's about bringing things that people may not have been aware of to them and allowing them, with all of the information you gave at the beginning, to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, like my issue with the religions is, of course, there's a lot of good in it, but there's also some very limiting beliefs in it. And I believe that there are as many paths to awakening as there are people
Mhm.
on this planet. And I say, take what resonates with you and leave the rest.
Mhm.
Find your own path. And you will find what works for you. As you said earlier, what is really important is to have your own experience. We had many people that were skeptical, but then they got their tower. And one of the things they started noticing is all these synchronicities that they simply could not explain, or things that they had been struggling with for so long. All of a sudden, they weren't an issue anymore, right? And that, I mean, there's different ways. Some people have developed their sensitivity because you have to develop it. I mean, we can perceive these more subtle realms. And you have people, I mean, first of all, we are all born that way, right? I mean, if you look at a little baby, it's like they look through you or like above you because, they look at your energy field. Look at animals, like a dog will perceive if somebody is not a nice, is not a nice person to animals. How does a dog know that? Well, because there are subtle waves that are being emitted from our field that animals are really in tune to. And you have people that develop these skills, like psychics, or that we program it out of our kids, right? Oh,
Mhm.
mommy, you look blue. No, 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 silly. Mommy doesn't look blue. Your aura might be blue at that moment. Mommy, there's somebody standing in the room. Oh, you silly. There's nothing standing in the room. You're just making that up. That is just your imagination. So, as you're also well versed in hypnosis, what happens when you develop this filter that you perceive to reality through? You start filtering all these things out. And it's not like you close your connection to the higher realms. It's just that you choose to no longer be aware of them because you run everything through a filter that has really been programmed by your authority figures and by the world around you. And then you start seeing everything through that filter. And that's one of the things after I woke up with what happened to my mom. I had to really start developing those skills again. One of the things I hadn't done for a long time was pay attention to my feelings. I was all up here in the head while the feelings carry so much more information and there's so much more in there. So it's something that people can tune into. Those that are well versed in it and that have built their sensitivity to that, they immediately feel the tower. For others, it's different. It shows that they see changes in their body, in their life, or see changes in their environment. Like their kids are more harmonious, their animals love it and they're around it. The plants are thriving, right? So there's different ways for different people.
Oh no, that's really interesting because also the other thing which is a misconception that confuses people is that if somebody wanted to purchase a second-hand tower, there's this idea of it being reprogrammed. And again, we're not talking about a machine here because with my tower experience, we had like I had a shared tower with Sara Kleiner in the US. I've brought it back now, but then I've got a mini one as well, but hasn't arrived yet, and it decided it wants to stay with Sara. So they do weird things. But I did if somebody is interested, but budget is limiting, and they see one that's secondhand, what does that mean? Does it mean you have to be careful? Does it work just the same? What does it actually mean, the attuning to a new owner?
Yeah, really, I mean, it's not necessarily needed, but people might want it. I mean, the tower stays activated. Once it's activated, that toroidal field is created and it just keeps running.
How do you activate a tower?
Well, it basically it gets energetically activated to create the toroidal field,
Okay.
right? Just like living water in the body can be programmed. I mean, look at our shapes, right? It's the same with living water in the towers. And once that toroidal field runs, it keeps running. Now, I don't like the term resetting or reprogramming. The way to look at it is more that it has honed in to the previous owner to focus on specific issues that that person might be dealing with, specific information or specific guidance that is needed. And what you can ask it to do is to release all that, so it's like a blank slate, so it can fully attune to you and your needs and the need of your family.
So just as an analogy, say if we have a holy guardian angel, it's sort of a bit like that it's sort of personal in that sense. And if I passed away, and if all of what we were talking about is real, because I'm always like, nothing's true, everything's possible. Would it just be like the guardian angel going to a different soul?
Yeah, you could look at it that way. To me, the angels are one collective
Yeah,
frequency. They're one frequency, but different people tune into different aspects
yeah,
of that frequency. And that serves them and serves their journey. For me, they're a collective, because the higher up in the dimensional realms you go, the less individuality. The closer you come to the one source, and you have more of the collective. So I see that with the towers as being the same, that's more collective, but people will align with particular frequencies or particular part of that consciousness that serves them the
and
most.
they might call it angel or spirit guide or grandma. I was just putting it in like very, very lay terms, so that people don't get, because it's very easy to get lost in the science and then start to doubt something because it's become too scientific. And if we bring it back to, and even if people don't believe in angels, like we've said, so what? Some people do, some people don't. It's just like I've said, it's a way of describing something, because our brains, all our brains want to do is add meaning and make a story that makes sense to us. So I think
Yes.
for the very scientific people, you've sort of covered it. I know you could have gone even deeper on a scientific level, but I think that's again for another time for specific questions, because you also answered the questions that people in my group sent you. I just wanted to bring back up one of the questions about consciousness, although you've actually answered it already, because like everything, there's no one word answer. And say if you had to sum up consciousness based on your huge knowledge and experience, how would you describe it?
Yeah, really, that everything that has an awareness
Mm,
and everything is alive. And we've also seen this in science and the work of Cleve Baxter, the
mm,
guy that invented the lie detector, the polygraph. He
mm,
got bored one day, hooked it up to his plans, and then at the intention, I'm going to burn your leaf.
mm,
And he noticed that there was a reaction. Water is conscious,
mm,
meaning that our intention changes the shape of the water, meaning that there is a communication. There is an exchange of energy. Epigenetics, Bruce Lipton, our DNA can be changed with our intention. And then I think in the book of Dr. Ibrahim Karim, there's another example where they hooked two people up to brain tracers and they separated them by 300 kilometers. People that knew each other, not really intimately, and all they did was they showed a picture, and they noticed that the brain waves would change in the other person that was 300 kilometers away. Not only did it change, but it changed instantly. So faster than light, communication through the telepathy, right? I mean, so everything is conscious, and that's how we have to see our environment. We're all one organism, that we are a cell of. We are a cell of the earth. You know, what one cell does affects the cell, but also affects all the cells around it. So we have to take a responsibility for our awareness, knowing that even looking at this tree, I'm exchanging information with this tree, which will alter the development of this tree, which will change its evolution. So we have to become really conscious, I would say really aware of not only what are we putting into our body with our thoughts, because remember, if we have bad intentions or we are in a bad mood, we're not only sending this out to the collective and to the people around us, but we're also changing the water structures within our body. That's why I think blessing or praying over your water is really beneficial, not just because you're then going to consume that water or give it to a plant, but what happens as you're doing this, you're changing the structure and the information in yourself, because you're also made up of water.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about, considering everybody else, not just yourself. I think that's kind of how to sum it up, because we're all fundamentally each other. So, yeah, definitely. I think thank you for doing this. It's been like really fascinating to listen. So if people want to hear more or learn about the tower or listen to you talk about other topics, because I know you have a YouTube channel where people there's a lot about the tower. Where can they go?
Yeah, they can go to thewellnessenterprise.com. We have a monthly Q&A. So every first Tuesday of the month at 3 p.m. Eastern time, we have a Zoom call that people can join, and they can ask their questions, but they can also hear from other people that have towers and their experiences. Because for me, this is when the community shares, I learn and everybody learns, because everybody has their own experiences, so they can learn in that call. They can go to the Wellness Enterprise, to our YouTube channel. We've done so many videos on the towers explaining different aspects. They can go there, and they can always write us too at support@thewellnessenterprise.com with any questions, and we'll be happy to answer those or take them to the Q&A, and then people can watch the replay. Then I also built the cosmictower.com before I was even involved in the project and importing the products into the US, because most of the information that was available was only in German. So I really built a collection of the information in English. And on there, if you go to the Connect page, Connect with us, there are also Telegram channels where we'll be posting content and where we will be announcing the Q&As. So there's plenty of resources for people.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Well, so thank you very much for doing this. And I'm sure we'll end up having another bigger and deeper conversation, because I know that you've got a lot more to say, but I think it's been a brilliant introduction to this topic.
Well, thank you, Sara, and thank you to your audience for listening and being interested in this.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this thought-provoking. And if you want to reach out to Nico or myself, the links are in the description. And also the slide deck is in the description if it's something that you want to have access to and read about the science in your own time. Up and coming content on the channel will be Dr. Petra, who's going to talk about deuterium, also Matt from Cultivate Elevate, as well as Dr. Carolyn Dean to talk about magnesium. Then I'm going to make some educational videos about the heart and circulation in preparation for Tom Cowan coming on. And again, thank you for watching and stay tuned.